Major breaking news. The United States Supreme Court has just denied cert in a huge case dealing with the future implications of our right to keep and bear arms and all American values, including the text of the United States Constitution. Specifically, the Supreme Court has just rejected a case brought by parents who complained that the local public school system in their state of Colorado had denied them the ability to raise their children the way they saw fit by virtue of behavior of the schools. What do I mean? What does it mean for our rights? Let's talk about it when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4 Boxes Down, a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you to those 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so the Supreme Court has just denied cert in the case of Lee versus Poudre, involving allegations by the plaintiffs that had sued a Colorado school district allegedly for doing things behind the backs of the parents with respect to their children. According to the allegations in the lawsuit, essentially the allegations were that the public school system was hosting events and doing certain things to allegedly encourage or allow for or educate children in these schools to learn about transitioning to a new gender. And that the parents were not made aware of this until after the fact. So this lawsuit was commenced in the state of Colorado in federal court, claiming that I'm the parent. This is my child. These are our children. Public school propagandists in the form of public school educators and public school teachers do not have the legal authority or the right to do things behind the backs of the parents. Contrary to what Hillary Clinton wrote in her book about it takes a village to raise a child, what it really requires is parents. And that is essentially what the Supreme Court is indicated in this case. But they denied cert. And why did they do this? And how does this impact our right to keep and bear arms and our Constitution in its entirety? Well, it turns out for various procedural reasons, I believe things like mootness and other technical arguments, the district court judge dismissed this lawsuit. And then the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit again reaffirmed the dismissal, saying this is not the right vehicle to address all these questions for various procedural reasons. So the parents sought cert from the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we're going to turn down the case here. We're going to deny cert. But there was a very important statement made by none other than Justice Sam Alito with the support of Trump appointee Neil Gorsuch and Justice Clarence Thomas. So even though they agreed with this case of Jonathan Lee was not the right vehicle because of procedural issues to address some of these questions, they flagged this as an important issue, specifically parental authority over the children as opposed to the state or the government being able to raise our children as they see fit. Here's what Justice Alito had to say with the support of Justices Gorsuch and Thomas. I concur in the denial of cert because petitioners do not challenge the ground for the ruling below, but I remain concerned that some federal courts are tempted to avoid confronting a particularly contentious constitutional question, whether a school district violates parents' fundamental rights when, without parental knowledge or consent, it encourages a student to transition to a new gender or assists in that process. Petitioners here tell us that there are nearly 6,000 public schools that have policies, as the government allegedly does here, that purposely interfere with parents' access to critical information about their children's gender identity choices and school personnel's involvement in and influence on those choices. The troubling and tragic allegations in this case underscore the great and growing national importance of the question that these parent petitioners present here. So that is a big signal, folks. So even though the Supreme Court said we're not going to hear this case for procedural problems, we're flagging this issue to be dealt with down the road. Now, at surface level, folks, this is a case about whether or not school districts can take certain steps as the government to encourage, educate, promote notions of children transitioning from one gender to another. All being done allegedly, apparently, behind the backs of the parents. So why am I flagging this particular issue for the Four Boxes Diner channel? Why am I flagging this issue of the role of parents versus government-run schools in the raising of our children involving the Second Amendment? How does all this tie up? Well, you know how this ties together. It is pretty clear that in the vast majority of the United States, in my view, as best I can tell, the public school system has become a propaganda mechanism for the Democratic Party and the party lines, including but not limited to that guns are bad, guns are dangerous, and you should be disarmed, and that the founding fathers started the American Revolution over taxes, when the reality is they started the revolution over gun control. The fear that by disarming the American colonists, they would be converted from citizens into serfs or worse, slaves, just like the Irish War in Ireland. That was a big concern. And when the British in America at the time of our founding went around trying to steal the guns and confiscate the guns, like General Thomas Gage in Boston did. And of course, we know that the whole purpose of the Lexington Concord battle was that the British had left Boston and marched to the countryside, not to rape and pillage the countryside, but to arrest a couple American patriots, including John Hancock, but more importantly, to seize the guns and the black powder that was being stored in that part of Massachusetts. In other words, the shot heard around the world in 1775 was not about marginal tax rates or corporate tax deductions. The shot heard around the world was about gun control and the attempt by the British to seize the American arms and black powder and ammunition from the colonists. That's what it was all about. But if you want to make sure that these kinds of lessons are not taught to American students, if you want nothing but propaganda that says the United States is a terrible country, that engaged in slavery, that oppressed the women, that are racist, are sexist, all these sorts of things, as opposed to a true and honest and complete telling of the great American story, then of course you're going to defer to those political propagandists in many parts of America known as our public school teachers. Now, I'm not saying all public school teachers are terrible or bad or propagandists, but it's pretty clear if you look at what the public teacher unions argue. To say the least, they're dramatically left of center politically, culturally, socially. It's pretty obvious. So when you see a case here where the Supreme Court is saying, look, parents have the authority, parents have the right to make decisions for their children, and government-run schools don't get to make decisions on behalf of the children without parental involvement, without the parents having the final say, that's a good sign. Because the last thing we need in America is for the public school systems to continue to function as a propaganda arm of the Democratic Party and the socialist left to say terrible things about American history, the American Constitution, the Founding Fathers, the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the Electoral College, and so on, which is what's been going on. And that is to assume that they teach the kids anything, because there's certainly a lot of evidence that the public school system is failing our students, our children, who in many instances doesn't seem to be learning a lot. And to the extent they learn anything, in some ways they're dumber for learning what they've learned because they've learned things that are wrong. Sometimes it's better to know nothing than to know the wrong thing. It's better to be dumb than to be propagandized and know something that is true when it really is not true. in my experience in the practice of law, where people really get into trouble is where they assume something is true and it turns out not to be, because they rely on a falsehood and make decisions based on that falsehood. And then it turns out down the road to really blow up in their legal faces, if you will, metaphorically, of course. So anyway, I think this is very good news that the Supreme Court and Justice Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch have flagged this issue, that a reaffirmation of the power and the authority of the parent over government-run schools and over the state must be reaffirmed. Because if the parents do not have the legal authority to raise their children as they see fit, and the government gets to take over, the outcomes for our country, including our Bill of Rights, including the right to free speech, including the right to bear arms, will not be good, in my view. So to close, pay attention to these cases involving the rights of parents versus the power of the state. Because if the state gets to raise our children and turn them into little good red communists, that's not going to be good for the West, our country, our Constitution, or anything else. And we have to be very much on alert now, because it's pretty clear in my view, if you look at, again, the political positions of the public teacher unions, they don't necessarily like America. They don't like the Constitution. They don't like guns. They don't like free speech. These are not your parents' liberals, if you will. These are not a bunch of hippies hanging out at Harvard Yard smoking pot, complaining about corporations and the man. I think this is a much more dangerous strain of progressivism, socialism, basically Marxism and communism that we seem to be seeing more and more across this country. And I fear that in many instances, the public school systems in many parts of this country are contributing to that troubling trend, which on the good news front, to be optimistic, we are seeing a rise of private schools, a rise of homeschooling, a rise of school choice, a rise in school vouchers, and so on. That, coupled with hopefully some more positive Supreme Court rulings that said that parents get to decide how their kids are raised and what they learn, as opposed to government-mandated or government-controlled public schools, this is good for all of us. And again, it may not come across initially as connected to the Second Amendment, but it very much is. Because the power to educate is important for our civil society. Because if they're always voting the wrong way and they always are cheering for the wrong thing, it's a problem. We do not want a younger generation arguing that the government should indeed take away all of their civil rights and all of their civil liberties. That will backfire big time on our society. But I'm happy to report, I think with channels like the Four Boxes Diner, other great YouTube channels that are out there, and other homeschooling processes and systems in place, I think it's gotten much harder for the political propagandists through the public school systems to succeed, but they're still very powerful, and they're there ready and waiting to do as much damage to America as they possibly can. And if they can start transitioning children to different genders behind the backs of the parents, just think about what else those public school systems could be doing to the children behind the backs of the parents. That's also detrimental to the children and to America. So there you have it, folks. Just connecting the dots here on some things that may not be obviously connected to the Second Amendment, but they really are. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you follow me over there on X at Four Boxes Diner. And don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. And I look forward to talking again real soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.